All right, let me go straight across to CNN's senior political analyst, John Avlon, who's joining us live from New York. Thanks very much, John, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18. Let's start with the key reasons behind what looks like an exceptionally tight race. Yes, the Republicans will certainly take back control of the House, but in the Senate, it is still up for grabs. And like I said earlier on, at this given point of time, it looks likelier that the Democrats might retain control of the Senate and not so much the Republicans. Despite, the war, the soaring prices of gas and groceries, how is it that this has not become a red wave? And how do the Democrats manage to hold off what could have been a red wave?
That's the question Republicans are asking themselves today, because all expectations in Washington and much of the public polling seem to indicate that traditional red wave. And what I mean by traditional is American midterm elections have a clear pattern in recent years. The opposition party to the president who controls the White House tends to gain significantly in the midterm elections, as independent voters in particular try to create some balance between the parties in Washington. One statistic that stood out to me is opposition parties have won an average of 46 House seats when the president is below 50% approval. That's since 1982, when Ronald Reagan was president. Nothing like that is going to happen in this midterm election. Instead, a lot of the gains that Republicans expected to make evaporated. Now, the Senate's still too close to call, and indeed polls show this would be too close to call. Democrats always had a hope they would hold on to it, but Republicans assumed there would be a significant swing in the House races to their favor. That has not materialized. And I think a big part of the reason is that while the issues of inflation are on people's minds and perceptions of rising crime, the candidates Republicans put forward at Donald Trump's request in many cases, election-denying candidates, seemed simply too extreme. And so the argument that democracy was itself on the ballot does seem to have resonated. It's always the economy stupid, but this year it's the extremism stupid.
I just want to go back to a point that you made that historically, midterm elections have always been sort of against the incumbent president in the White House, whichever party he or she may belong to, Let's go back in time. In 1994, when Bill Clinton lost his first midterms, the Democrats lost something like 53 House seats. Obama, after the historic election in 2008, in 2010, in the Tea Party election, he lost 63 House seats. Biden's losses in comparison, at best, would be in the range of 30 or so. Again, what may this mean for the remainder of his term? Does this potentially give him encouraging signs, if you will, to consider a 2024 rerun?
Well, I think, first of all, it's important to keep in mind that while, as you say, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama suffered what Obama called a shellacking in their midterm elections, they both went on to win re-election handily. And that's, of course, good news if you're in the Biden White House today. Now, there are additional factors that Biden has to take into account, questions about his age, but the economy and the other things that had been stacking up against him. People forget that in terms of his first-term legislative record, he can be called a consequential president. There was actually a lot of bipartisan legislation that passed. Now, it didn't have the impact that many folks hoped in terms of the middle class and moderates in the economy, but Republicans didn't put forward a compelling counter message either in terms of how they'd solve those problems. You asked what's the likely outcome and how it will impact the rest of the Biden presidency. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Republicans take the House, but by a narrow margin, and Democrats narrowly keep the Senate. Well, what that means is the House will actually be more extreme because the House of Representatives, the extremist candidates who survive this midterm election, will have more influence because Republicans will need to have every vote to pass legislation. And so that's the danger. That's the nightmare scenario that people like Kevin McCarthy are facing. He had planned to announce a quick leadership vote and expected a larger margin. Doesn't look like he's going to have that. If Democrats keep the Senate, you'll have a balance between the two chambers. But if you have Republican narrowly controlling the Senate and the House, it will be full opposition. It won't be as full-throated, and maybe there'll be a prayer of some bipartisan legislation, but that's really a recipe for gridlock, unfortunately, as opposed to reasoning together, because so much of the common ground in politics has evaporated. Although this election should remind people the common ground still does exist.
I want to talk a little bit about, these extremist candidates that you talked about, election deniers among them. According to the Washington Post, more than 200 Republican candidates who were running in these midterms have denied the legitimacy of the 2020 vote, the presidential election which Joe Biden won. Many of these candidates have been endorsed by Donald Trump. What made this mean for not just the divided politics of America, but more importantly, the faith that American people have in its democratic institutions?
It's been a very dangerous moment because election denialism is not like other forms of extremism we've faced. It's a full-throated lie created out of whole cloth by Donald Trump to preserve his ego because he lost the last election. But he couldn't accept it, and neither could his hardcore supporters. And in the core problem of American politics, as in many democracies, being hyperpartisanship and polarization, those election deniers did well in the closed Republican primaries because they had Donald Trump's support, because they were willing to echo his lie. But they fared less well in the general election, and that's what's hopeful. Again, we face all sorts of different perceptions of extremism. The Democratic Party has their own baggage as well. But election denialism is uniquely dangerous for these three reasons. One, democracy depends upon an assumption of goodwill among fellow citizens. Election denialism obliterates that. Second, democracy depends upon a shared set of facts so we can reason together to solve common problems. Well, definitionally, election denialism destroys that as well. And so the compounding problem means we can't have a common language. And so when you look at a lot of Americans polling saying that they're concerned about the future of the country, the stability of our democracy, they're not necessarily at all reflecting on the party in power. They're representing on the persistence of Donald Trump's influence inside the Republican Party. But the repudiation of these candidates weakens Donald Trump's hand for any future political presidential campaign that he clearly expected to answer. And it means that there will be more voices inside of the Republican Party who have the courage to speak out what many of this said in private, which is this is a baseless lie that has driven their party into a comparative ditch, even if they make narrow gains. It's so far short of what they expected. And here's the final measure I'd use. Independent voters, some folks might know, actually, there are more independent voters in America than Republicans or Democrats. Independent voters almost always swing against the party in power. This election, CNN exit polls show that independent voters actually narrowly sided with Democrats by 49 to 47. That's unheard of in midterm elections. And that's a direct repudiation, I believe, of Donald Trump and those election-denying candidates that were put forward.
So what made this mean for Trump's own he's certainly harboring thoughts of running for re-election in 2024. He's promising that there's going to be a big announcement on the 15th next week. Trump himself had endorsed close to 300 candidates between the House and the Senate in this particular midterm. Not many of them have tasted success. What made this mean for Trump's own announcement of a potential, seeking another term in 2024, that announcement that he's been teasing for the 15th? And how may that change the Republican field? If Trump were to announce on the 15th, what may a Ron DeSantis, how may he react, or a Nikki Haley or a Marco Rubio or anyone who's potentially looking at running in a Republican primary?
Well, the conventional wisdom was that Donald Trump wanted to announce early so he could A, take credit for huge Republican gains in the midterm elections, B, clear the field by having other Republicans afraid to get in because of his famous name calling, and third, that he would be able to essentially outflank the many legal and court challenges he is facing for allegedly illegal or unethical actions around whether it's business or the January 6th attack of the Capitol and whatever role he played in that, as courts may determine, in addition to his on-tape efforts to try to get Georgian Republicans to overturn the election on his behalf. All those court cases are going forward, and his belief was, if I declare my presidential campaign, it will make those prosecutions look like a persecution. Well, now, he can't take credit for a huge Republican wave. And more Republican candidates are likely to have the spine to stand up and say, Donald Trump is destructive to our party and we cannot have him be the future, because the results will be the same as in the past. Losing the popular vote at the very least, and possibly quite more than that, given how unpopular Donald Trump is in the American people writ large. Just because you're popular in your party, of course, doesn't mean you're popular with the American people writ large, and Donald Trump is definitively not. He's less popular than Joe Biden, who's underwater. So I think it won't give him pause necessarily, because he only does what he thinks is in his self-interest. And he likes the attention, he likes the money, he likes the power and influence it gives him. But I do hope, for the sake of American democracy, that it inspires more Republicans to stand up and run for president if they feel that Donald Trump's not the right path forward. Not only run themselves, but also more influential Republicans standing up and supporting those candidates as opposed to being afraid of Donald Trump, which many of them have been, which have led them to sort of acquiesce to his election lies to date with destructive impact on American democracy and the Republican Party, as we saw from these elections.
Yeah, I guess the first test would be the election of the Speaker, the House Majority Leader, and so on in the U.S. House of Representatives. For the moment, though, thank you very much, John Avlon, for joining us with your perspective, your thoughts. Like I said at the top, it was a good night for the Republicans, not necessarily a great one, not the kind of red wave that they were expecting. So why is that? Let's break it down for you on the magic wall. The Senate, the Republicans were hoping that they can control both chambers of Congress. That has not come to pass. It's a dead heat, 48 Republican, 48 Democrats right now. Remember, the Republicans need 51. The Democrats need just 50. That's the magic figure because they have the tiebreaker vote of the vice president, which is Kamala Harris. Now, what went wrong for the Republicans? This state of Pennsylvania, that was the flip state. That was the flip seat. John Fetterman versus Dr. Mehmet Oz. John Fetterman flipping that seat from Republican to Democrat. So what that means is that gives the Democrat Party luxury. It does not give luxury to the Republicans, which means the Republicans will have to carry through Wisconsin, which they likely will. Ron Johnson there leading by about 50,000 votes or so. But they have to flip between Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia. They have to flip at least 2 out of those 3. In Nevada, it's an interesting race. The Senate seat there. In Arizona, it's Mark Kelly versus Blake Masters. Mark Kelly, of course, has run up a huge lead there. But there is still a lot of vote that is left to be counted in Arizona. So that's going to be one race to watch out for. In Nevada, Catherine Mastio is leading, again, slender margin there. But it looks likely if she keeps that lead, if the Democrats keep the leads both in Nevada and Arizona, then it's game over for the Republicans. Then the Georgia result does not even matter. The Georgia result, again, is going to be a very, very close affair because neither candidate, neither Raphael Warnock nor Herschel Walker has been able to get that magic figure of 50% plus 1 vote, which means that it has to go into a runoff. If it goes into a runoff in December, then it is again a toss-up. But, like I said, the Republicans need to win both of Nevada and Arizona if the Georgia runoff needs to be in play. If they don't win either of Nevada and Arizona, then the Democrats get up to that magic figure of 50, which is where they need to be because they have the casting vote or the tiebreaker vote of Kamala Harris. Let's take a quick look at the House. Like I said, it has been a good night as far as the House of Representatives is concerned for the Republicans. 201 currently, just 182 to the Democrats. But the losses for the Democrats, and if you look at the pickups, the Democrats have picked up 4 seats. The Republicans have picked up 10 seats. There were about 23 competitive races at the start of election night, of which the Republicans have won about 19 of them. If they win 23, they get to the magic figure of 218. But they were hoping for a much bigger, a much larger majority in the House of Representatives. That, of course, makes their legislative agenda much more easier to carry through. But remember what the Democrats had in 2018. It was 222. Will the Republicans get to 222? Will they get less than that, more than that? I think that is an interesting figure to watch out for. And finally, in the governor's races, very quickly, we had, of course, Ron DeSantis. And this has been one of the stories of not just this election, but the last couple of election cycles. Florida. Florida is now red country. It's red territory. Ron DeSantis carrying the state again. In Georgia, again, it hasn't been that great a night for Donald Trump or his candidates because Brian Kemp, the Georgia governor who had a public run-in with Donald Trump after the 2020 election, he has managed to keep that state. Greg Abbott winning in Texas. So if you look at it, it's pretty much, even Stevens as far as the governor's races are concerned. 24 to the Republicans and 22 to the Democrats. The Democrats, of course, one heartening factor for them would be that they've got the governorships in Colorado, in New Mexico, and in Kansas, which is supposed to be Bible Belt. It's supposed to be the heartland of America. You now have a Democratic governor in Kansas. So let me go across to our guests and just broaden this out. What made the midterm election results the fact that it's not been that great a night for the Republicans. What may this mean in foreign policy terms? Meera Shankar is former Indian ambassador to the United States. Stephen Golub is an international affairs expert. Meera Shankar, first things first, I think everybody is concerned about the immediate fallout, and that is what happens to the war in Ukraine. If the Republicans were to take the House and take the House in a big way, I think Kevin McCarthy has already said that they will put a stop to this blank check that's been given to Ukraine. Now that it's looking more even, Stevens, yes, the Republicans get the House, the Democrats may likely get the Senate. Does that mean that the war effort in Ukraine will continue, this blank check will continue, and this almost endless supply of weapons will continue?
Well, I think that there will be pressure to nudge Ukraine in the direction of negotiations. And this will come from both the speed breakers that the Republicans have said they will put on aid to Ukraine, which will not be unquestioned in future, and from the progressives in the Democratic Party, who had also written a letter to Biden. I think almost 30 or more of them had written a letter basically saying that you can't have war as an open-ended project, and that, at the end of the day, talks are necessary. And of course, the administration had come down like a ton of bricks on them, and the letter was withdrawn. But I do think that both these pressures will operate, and you will see perhaps some degree of a greater push on Ukraine to consider negotiations. As it is, Jake Sullivan has been in touch with his Russian counterpart and has been nudging the Ukrainians, not specifically to a set of talks, but to accept the principle of talks and not to rule out talks with Putin as they have been doing till now. I do expect that, or at any rate hope, that there will be a push towards a more diplomatic efforts on Ukraine, as opposed to an open-ended war.
Let me ask Stephen Golub. Next week, Joe Biden is going to be at the G20 in Bali. There's supposed to be a meeting between him and Xi Jinping. It was all sort of factored in that it's going to be a weakened Biden. The Republicans are going to win the House and the Senate, but that has not come to pass. The Republican majority in the House is not as big as they expected. The Senate will most likely stay in Democratic control. It's not as weakened a Biden as was expected a week or 10 days ago. How may that change his own interactions there at the G20 vis-a-vis Xi Jinping? People are still talking about a potential meeting between him and Putin. We don't even know if Putin's going to go to the G20. But how may that change the way the rest of the world's leaders approach him and the way he approaches them?
Well, that's a good question. I think the answer is almost found within your question, that he comes away from this election stronger than anticipated, and that may affect how other world leaders see him. They won't see him as necessarily a lame duck or presiding over a big electoral loss. And that can have ripple effects, positive ripple effects for Biden and the U.S. in terms of foreign policy. Now, having said that, there are a couple of things I want to comment on from the previous speaker, the fellow who'd spoken previously. Well, one thing just to start with is it's not clear, I believe, that the Republicans will necessarily take back the House. It's likely, but it's not absolutely clear yet. A lot of mail-in and other votes still have to be counted in some key districts. One matter that was highlighted by that previous guest is an optimism that leaders will now push back against Donald Trump, against election denialism. We've heard that before, including when Trump seemed to be weakened after the horrible insurrection, the seizure of the Capitol, where the House and Senate meet, by a mob that he inspired. It looked like the Republicans were going to push back very strongly against him. There were rumbles along those lines, including by the House minority leader, perhaps Speaker to be Kevin McCarthy. That didn't happen. Now, just to get back briefly to the matter of where Biden stands in foreign policy at this next big meeting and afterwards. If in fact the Republicans take control of the House, they will hamper him at every turn for political reasons, and that could undercut elements of his foreign policy, not least in Ukraine.
Okay, let me ask Meera Shankar. Of course, as far as the US-India relationship is concerned, there has been a bipartisan nature to it for the last 30 years or so. But having said that, with the Biden administration, even though India has become a major defense partner and there are regular visits and so on and so forth, the fact that even an ambassador has not come here and taken charge yet, is that a bit of a niggle? And of course, American concerns about India continuing to buy Russian oil. It used to be less than 1% when this war began. It's now upwards of 20%. Of course, India has its own justification for it. Are these niggles, or is this something that is sort of fundamentally denting the relationship?
I don't think it's fundamentally denting the relations. I think the US would have been happier if our policy on Ukraine and Russia had been more closely aligned with theirs. But they have accepted the fact that India's geopolitical situation is such that it cannot sever ties with Russia, given that 60% of its defense equipment is of Russian origin, and our troops are currently deployed in a live manner on the border with China. Yeah. So we are just not in a position to, align our policy with the US on Ukraine. And as I said, there is an acceptance of this, as also an acceptance of the fact that both countries do have a close convergence with regard to the Indo-Pacific, and both are committed to take those cooperative arrangements forward fairly robustly, and have been doing so.
Okay, let me give Stephen Golub the final word. Just in terms of the other big consequential relationship bilaterally is US-China. And we haven't had a state visit either by Biden to China or by Xi Jinping to the United States. They could likely meet in Bali next week. A not-so-weakened Biden, would that give him more elbow room to try and cut a deal with Xi Jinping? Or, again, is there a bipartisan nature to the relationship between Beijing and Washington now? What Trump started, Biden's pretty much continuing in that same vein.
Yes. I think, that's another good question. I believe that the U.S.-China relationship is so complex right now that we're not going to see any big master deal cut in any way between between Biden and Xi. And in some ways, China is being very expansionist and aggressive in both its economic and military policies, which exacerbates matters. As far as India is concerned, if I may add, I understand the India-Russia relationship for all the very good reasons that your other guests just stated. But it's very important also to keep in mind that in terms of China, Russia is now the little brother in that relationship, Russia-China. Yep. China is the more powerful party in most respects and and certainly is economically much more powerful. So when India calculates and calibrates where it's going to come out regarding Ukraine and other matters regarding Russia, you can't count on Russia, because if India and China are bumping heads, hopefully not militarily, but certainly in terms of foreign policy, Russia is inevitably going to be siding with China. It's not a reliable partner for India at all in any way. China can really veto lots of things that India might want Russia to do. That's a very important factor.
I got to wrap up. Thank you very much, Stephen Golub and Meera Shankar, for joining us. Yes, midterm elections usually have far greater domestic ramifications than foreign policy ones. But because it's the United States and because so much is at stake,